All right, so this evening we have a panel of experts assembled by Elizabeth Rose, to my right, who will be your moderator. Liz and her friend Deva Temple are the co-creators of this fantastic book, From the Fire. And if you haven't got a copy, we have them available for sale. All net proceeds go to fire relief. It's a wonderful book illustrated by photos and prose and poems, thoughts of the community. And Liz and Deva shared many of the photos. If you haven't had a chance to see our current exhibit, by the way, you can hang around a little bit after the event is over. Maybe have a look. It includes a lot of the photographs from the book, a lot of other things. We were wondering when we set it up, would it be too soon? It is soon, but it's not history yet. But I think it was a cathartic thing, and so we're glad we did it, and we hope you have a chance to check it out. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Rose, who is a lawyer specializing in mediation and an editor, and with David Temple, the co-creator of this wonderful book. We're so glad she did it. Thank you, Liz. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, thank you all for being here. I know this might sound a little weird, but before we get started on this, I thought maybe we should take a couple of seconds of silence and gratitude for the fact that we're here together as this beautiful town, that our town survived the Thomas Fire last year. So to give thanks for that, and also to honor our sister communities to the north and the south who lost so much that we didn't lose. So maybe 20 seconds, just enjoy being together here. Thank you. Thank you. So this is a big panel. I was told when I pulled these wonderful people together that this was a big panel. But I thought that it was important for us to have a conversation that really covered everything from concerns about evacuation and how to protect our current structures to what should we be building in the future and how should we be addressing climate change and global warming and more fires and natural disasters like this. So what I did was I phrased a question for each panel member to start the conversation, and then I'm hoping to invite all of you to share your concerns and your questions, because part of the conversation on how best to move forward as a community and create fire readiness is to understand the concerns of the community. And unless you ask your questions or share your concerns, then we as a community don't know what they are. So hopefully this will become the first of many dialogues. I'm going to introduce everybody, and then I'm going to get started. We have our Ojai Police Chief, James Freihoff. We have Division Chief of the Ventura County Fire Department, John McNeil. We have Ed Bennett, who is the Director of Facilities at the Thatcher School. We have Charlie Whitman, who has 40 years of experience in wildland fire service as a firefighter and implementing a fire hazard fuel reduction program for the Santa Monica Mountains Recreation Area. We have Will Castagna, yes? Yeah. Who is the current board president of the Ojai Valley Fire Safe Council, and he'll talk more about what that is. We have Ray Powers, who is the Ojai Planning Commissioner, an Ojai Planning Commissioner, and a fire resilient home advocate. And then we have Connor Jones, who is a permaculture designer and teacher and founder of East End Eden, a permaculture demonstration site here in Ojai. So we got him. We got it all. So thank you all for being here. Jim. Okay, I want to have you talk a little bit about how evacuations get decided and how they are implemented, and then if you could also share a little bit about what reasonable expectations are in terms of communication so people can understand that better as well.
Okay, so the Sheriff's Department, who has ultimate authority in deciding evacuations formally, has a process that we go through determining, depending on the threat. Obviously, with fires, there's no prediction that it's coming. All of a sudden, one starts. And so if you are at the epicenter of a fire start, you are your biggest advocate for evacuation. Do not wait for us to tell you it's time to leave. One thing that we know is these fires are moving much quicker than they have in years past. I'm sure some of that is climate issues that we're having. The ground is much drier. We have gone much longer without any rain. And obviously with the Thomas fire, there wasn't any rain preceding the start on December 4th. And so the fire was moving upwards of an acre a second. And from a place where the fire starts, it's very difficult for us to get out in front of at the very beginning, at the very onset. So some of the discussion on evacuations is we as the Sheriff's Office know that it's very inconvenient to displace people from their homes, so we don't take the decision to evacuate lightly. We have two different types of evacuations. We have a voluntary and then a mandatory. As I'm sure most of you know by now, mandatory does not mean you have to leave. Mandatory is our strongest recommendation that you leave. And I think if you read the book, I have a quote in there that basically says, once we ask you to leave, we say you're under mandatory evacuation. If you choose not to, then we're going to follow it up with how many people are here. And the simple reason for that is when we come back, if the structures are burned, we want to know how many people we're looking for. So although morbid, that's the reality. There's a good chance that we're not going to have an opportunity to come back and tell you a second time. So when we do our announcements, we try and do one through our VC alert system, which calls you. You have to sign into this, right? We have whatever your numbers you have through your phone company for your home. But many people over the years have gotten away from home phones and now only have cell phones. So please make sure that you opt into those services so that we can make that initial notification. Once again, that process takes time to do the notification and then for us to assemble staff to come and evacuate your homes. For those that are not aware, the Ojai Valley, which I oversee, not only am I the chief of police for the city of Ojai, but I'm the captain for the whole unincorporated Ojai Valley. So I have from Stanley and 33 all the way up to and including Lockwood Valley and then up to the summit. So that's my area of responsibility. I have two officers who live in Lockwood Valley and they patrol 610 square miles of backcountry. That's two officers. And then in the greater Ojai Valley, I have 5, 2 assigned to the city and 3 in the unincorporated area. So when we have a large fire, as we did, I'm using all of my resources very quickly and we're calling in as many additional resources as possible. Obviously this fire touched Santa Paula and Ventura as well as Ojai when it first started. So getting resources, you're tapping a very limited pool to get those resources here quickly. So one of the things that I want to advocate for is being informed, have a plan, and have a kit and be ready. California is no stranger to disasters. We have many. We have earthquakes, we have fires, we have floods, potentially all of them in the same year. And typically right after a fire is when we're most susceptible to floods. Now I know that the very first year of the floods, the rains that came right after the fire when Montecito got struck, the threshold for debris flow is a ½ inch of rain an hour. Obviously Montecito got way more than that when the storm struck their hillside. We were fortunate in that it was just the winds blew it north from us. It could have very easily had happened here as far as the amount of rainfall that hit Montecito could have hit here. I was working 24 hours in my office watching the storm come in with a contingent of officers as well as our search and rescue teams who are volunteers that were prepared to go and do evacuations should the need arise. One thing that we did after that fire broke out is we broke the fire into zones. And those zones were determined based on some geological features of each of those areas based on what the threat for flood would be so that we could say, okay, if the rain is hitting here, this is the first area that we need to evacuate with our limited resources and then target them down the line. So from an evacuation standpoint, yes, we have ultimate authority. From an official evacuation standpoint, there's a phone call that's made between a variety of resources, and that's the fire department, the county watershed protection district, our geologists, the National Weather Service. We're all on a conference call. Anytime there's a storm, actually even on the forecast now, we're on a conference call leading up to that, getting an idea of how much rain we're supposed to get, whether or not it's going to trigger any thresholds for debris flow, and whether or not we need to start putting in voluntary or mandatory evacuation orders in our area. And Chief McNeil and I are pretty familiar with those calls, and Yeah, like I said, every time there's one on the forecast, we get notified that there's going to be a conference call, so we can start the discussion 3 days out from a wind event or rain event, because we at least have that notification. With a fire and earthquake, as you know, we have no notification at all. One of the challenges that many people will face is with power outages. If you are reliant on a device to be notified by us, and the power goes out and that device doesn't work, well, now you're not getting notified by that device. So you have backup redundant methods of notification, and then be paying attention to what's happening. If you know we're having a huge Santa Ana wind event, you should be really paying attention for the fires that are going to follow it. If you know that there's a storm coming, you should have a pretty good idea where you sit on the hillside, where the debris channels are, whether you're above the debris channel or below it, or on the sides of it, right? Know where you're at and what your risks are, and then start listening to those thresholds. Now, before, I guess it was in maybe October, the National Weather Service came up along with our county geologists, myself, and the Office of Emergency Services, and the fire department went out and surveyed our burn areas, and they determined, they being the National Weather Service, determined that we were considered to be in 1 year of recovery, which is good. The 1 year mark meant that the little rain we did get last year gave us enough ground cover growth to raise the threshold for debris flow to 3/4 of an inch of rain an hour instead of 1/2 inch an hour. So that's a big jump for us. Gives us a little bit more comfort, if you will, because it's a pretty strong rain that brings that 3/4 of an inch or more. The question mark for all of us is thunderstorms. If a storm has thunderstorms, it can bring a lot of rain very quickly, and you have no idea where in that storm it's going to hit. So it makes it very uneasy for us on doing evacuations and what that looks like. So we have to upstaff accordingly so that we can start making evacuations with very, very short notice. And so for you, the key is to be paying attention, be alert to the fact that if we have thunderstorms and we're forecasting that amount of rain and you're in a flood area, that you might want to have a bag packed so that when we knock, or if you think, you know what, I just need to go to a friend's house today, then we encourage that. Just remember, there's only 3 ways out of this valley, and anytime it rains, they all get closed. So if you're going to make the decision to leave based on those notices, you might want to leave sooner than later.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did I go too long? Did I answer all parts of your
You
question?
answered everything. In fact, all my other questions for you, I don't have to ask you now. So
Do I get an A?
you got an A. That's why you're in chair number 1.
Good luck, John.
We are so good now. We are so good now. John, you have 1.5 minutes because Jim took up. So, does it work? Okay. So my question for you is also kind of 2-part. I wanted to have you talk about how fire works, the topography, the fuel, the land, the wind, so people understand that, and then how they can then take that and go home and look at their own house, right, and say, okay, it's situated here. I want them to transfer that information to their own home, because then they can make smart decisions.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And before I get into answering, I just wanted to tag on what Jim had said, articulated well, is on the evacuations. It can be overwhelming to think, all right, we're ready to go. I think we're ready to go. Do we have everything? Is everything accounted for? Do we have a plan? And the Ventura County Fire Department on the website, vcfd.org, I'll mention that a couple of times tonight, has your own personal wildfire action plan. And it's based on a ready, set, go slogan. So I just encourage you all to invest some time and some effort into creating your own plan, so when it is time to evacuate, it doesn't seem so overwhelming. And it has a checklist, and it's a good resource to fall back on, use to get ahead of it, but also fall back on at the moment. So what influences wildfire? It's been mentioned in a couple of presentations, but simply speaking, it's fuel, weather, and topography. All 3 of those influence wildfire. So fuel, how does that influence a wildfire? You can imagine dry fuel, lighter fuel, which would be grasses over trees or brush, would have a more positive impact on the intensity of the way fire burns. The way fuel is spaced out or continuous is important. That also has an effect. Obviously, continuous fuel is going to have more of an impact in a negative way for us. Topography, fire's going to burn faster uphill. as it would downhill or on flat ground. So consider, when we consider that, if your house is up above fuel, that could have a negative impact when you're planning for how fire is going to impact your house. So if fire burns uphill quicker, lighter, drier fuels are going to burn more intense. Weather is probably the biggest influence on wildfire. And I'd have to say on the Thomas fire, between fuels and weather, those were the key factors. And when I talk weather, I'm talking wind in particular. So the forecast going into the Thomas fire was not only wind, but low humidities and fairly high temperatures considering the time of year. So 70-mile-an-hour winds is going to push a fire quite rapidly. The start of the Thomas fire was in the Steckel Park area. It reached the western edge of the city of Ventura, if you know where the cross is up there, that reference point. That's 12 miles in 5 hours. So that's pretty impressive fire behavior. So again, fuel, weather, and topography are the key factors on what influences wildfire. So I think it's a good message to get out there and to try and understand. There's a lot more to it, obviously. I'm just hitting the surface of it. But if you start grasping how those variables influence it, when you go back home or to a place you're looking at trying to make more fire safe, you can take that into account and mitigate accordingly. So. Did I answer that?
Thank you. You did. You answered that. Thank
Less
you.
than a minute 10? Is that what I have?
You were great. You were great. You were good too, Jim. I'm fine. Mr. Bennett, Ed. So the Thatcher School was surrounded and had so much success with the fire. And so what I was hoping you could do is talk about what you had done for the Thatcher School to get prepared for fire and what you're planning to do going forward, because I know that you have some ideas.
Well, I would really echo a couple things that I just heard. One of the things that we do at the Thatcher School is we do take seriously the notice that we get from your office. That's kind of threatening to tell us to make sure, and that's okay, by the way, to tell us to make sure that we clear our fire lanes and take back our brush and do what we can to sort of minimize the fuel aspect that the chief just talked about. And I think the other thing is that we just, over the years, Thatcher's had the opportunity to, I think in 1985, according to Michael, and some other times. So we have a robust water main system around the campus, and we do have 1.25 million gallons of water that's available to us, which we really learned is not enough after this particular incident. And so I think a lot of it is just making sure that we're doing those things that I think you would recommend everybody does, which is, knock down the fuel around your residences or your buildings and just take care of things. And also, exercise your emergency plans. And something that I kind of mentioned, and that is we have, as a school, of course, we have an emergency preparedness plan, and we have, in fact, we had just a month prior or so gone through an evacuation and how we would do that. And we have two different ways we would do it. We know that. And we were ready to do both of them the night of the fire. So a lot of it is just really in the preparation. And I know for us, coming out of where we were, we have things that we're working on with respect to power. I mean, we were so fortunate. The power went out, and then the power came back on. And it would have been a totally different experience for us maybe if the power hadn't been there, because where our water tanks are, require power to fill them up. And communication, again, I'm sitting at my desk and I have the internet. And so I can help, the folks from Livermore get maps of the area and do things like that, which if, the power hadn't been there, we wouldn't have been able to do. So we have plans to have more emergency power. And we also want to increase the amount of water we have, which I had mentioned. And we're looking at some other systems. We had just installed over the summer a system that allowed me to have my grounds manager, who was in Santa Paula. I told him not to come to the campus, and he was operating our sprinkler system around the campus to include areas. And eventually, some of the folks asked us if we were doing something, and we were doing it without anybody being there. Whether it helped or not, I don't know, but it was something that we were able to do. So we're going to expand on that. type of system. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I love that sprinkler system. It's like, I joked, like you could be in Rome and turn on the sprinkler at the Thatcher School. But such a smart thing, because if we could create that in people's homes, I don't know what the cost of something like that is, you could be away and someone can say, the fire's heading down Rice Road, and you can go onto your computer and turn on your sprinkler, which saves water so you're not just running it for the whole, I just think it's an interesting. Charlie, I was hoping that you could talk about ways to protect existing structures, both before a fire, but then also, now the fire's coming towards you and the fire department can't get to you, and what are you gonna do?
So it's pre-planning is probably the most important thing you can do. Everything's been talked about quite a bit, except I think retrofitting structures, trying to find those pieces on the building that are vulnerable to embers and heat. And if you can't afford to do that, I think the sprinkler system, using a water supply that's independent from the municipal system. I know that's a lot to put into your home, but I think it's worth it.
And when the fire's coming towards you, is there last minute things that, because that right? So somebody thinks their house is ready and then,
Turn on the sprinkler system.
and leave.
Yeah, and certainly, I think maybe emotionally prepare yourself for the worst.
Right.
There's a lot of things you can't control. And so, my experiences are that there's much you can do. Half the homes on the street I lived on survived, and the other half didn't. Can you analyze, what it was? And I think a lot of that's already been covered as far as slope,
Yeah.
fuels, wind direction, things like that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Will, can you talk about what Ojai Fire Safe Council does, the resources available to the town? I know that some people know about the organization and other people might not.
Right. So, thank you. The Ojai Valley Fire Safe Council has been around since 2000. We've kind of kept a low profile. Mostly what we do is two things. Our slogan is wildfire safety through education and action. And so we've been doing the education piece by going into, some of you may remember the neighborhood by neighborhood initiative that we took to go in and with County Fire, who came along with us and helped us do preparation education. We have a website that we built that's got all kinds of great resources. We link to the Ready, Set, Go program. We really encourage people to especially focus on the ready part because that, in advance is the right time to be, before there's a fire threatening, that's the right time to be sitting at your kitchen table and thinking about what you would take and what should we have in our emergency kit and what's our route. So we have on our website resources to actually fill in a form that's a family safety plan for emergencies, and you can email it to yourself as a PDF and put it on your fridge. So you've thought about that, and put down your thoughts, and you can print as many copies of that so everybody in your family has a copy or knows where it is, so you know where to meet and who your primary contacts are if you have to evacuate, where you're going to go, and all that great stuff. The action part is we've worked on the Last Stand fuel break. We've done a lot of work in Matilaha Canyon. We apply for and have been fairly successful at winning grants to do wildfire safety house out defensible space plans. So we go up to 300 feet, but at the very least 100 feet out from the house. And we've been able to be very effective. We were very excited that, we never wanted to test what we did, but we did a lot of work in Matilaha Canyon, and we were very excited that when fire came through. Thanks to a lot of factors, they didn't lose any major structures, any homes in the section of the canyon that we were able to get funding to work on. So it does work. There was a lot of other factors, so it's not just that, but it's exciting for us to know that our work has had an impact, and I encourage you to go to the website, take advantage. We also have a great tool on there that's called a Home Wildfire Safety Survey, and there's a link to that in our resource section, which allows you to answer a number of questions. They're simple to answer, just about your house and what's around your house and how it's built, and it'll give you a home wildfire safety score. But in addition to giving you a score, it also gives you ways to improve that score and sorts those by things that are free to do, things that might have a nominal cost, and some other things that you might consider investing in to raise your home wildfire safety score. So again, just part of our education effort, we want people to know what to do, to have the resources available to them when an event happens, that have been prepared in advance so that you know what to do when the time comes and you don't have a lot of time to think about it.
Thank you. Ray, when thinking about rebuilding homes after the fire or for new developments, are there architectural designs that will make the homeowner less vulnerable to wildfire?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Connor? Can you talk a little bit about what those are, please?
Well, throughout history, people have used all sorts of materials to build homes other than timber. We have a lot of timber that used to grow in the area, so timber was built. The Spanish used adobe. If we look at the data after the Thomas fire and data, someone's correcting my English. My mom was a speech pathologist, so I'm very used to that. If we look at the data, we find, and even locally, the buildings that survived the fire were made out of steel or cob or straw bale. Now, some people think straw bale, they think of bales of straw, but that's just within the walls, and they're usually covered with 2 inches of cob or earthen plaster. Up at the Ojai Foundation, 5 buildings survived, and they were cob or straw bale. That's not to say tear down your house and rebuild, but with the state allowing residents to build ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in each of your lots, I think it's important to look at other forms of building materials that are more fire resilient than timber. There was a beautiful little film made about John Davis's house in Upper Ojai. He's an architect. It's made of steel. He also has steel, for lack of better, walls, if you will, that slid in front of the windows, and his house survived. So I think, you know, it's a multi-tiered challenge with what I'll call alternative building, but it's really not all that alternative. It's sort of like saying organic farming, but that's not all that, you know, that's what our ancestors did. So what we call alternative building is really what our ancestors built. You look at some of the buildings in the Middle East, Near East, throughout Europe that are made of cob, which is really, it's clay, it's soil, dry grass mixed in there, or straw, dry straw, and water. And so you're basically making mud with some kind of structure and putting over it. So they're beautiful forms. There's lots out there. There's also super adobe buildings. You can look up CalEarth.org, I think it is, and see what they're doing out there. So part of the biggest challenge is the law. It's illegal to build these structures within our county at this time. Straw bale is in the code. I'm not clear whether you're actually allowed to reside in those buildings or not, or they can just be meeting halls. So the biggest challenge we face as citizens is being proactive with our policymakers. And I want to say I'm not speaking on behalf of the Planning Commission of the City of Ojai. I'm on the Planning Commission. I have a lifelong interest in building and architecture using other than wood. This year I went to the California Straw Bale Association conference, and it was fascinating seeing what's happening throughout the country. And even in this area, you know, there are buildings built this way that people are dwelling in, and they have to be way under the radar. So my call to action for all of us is to speak to the policymakers so it's not illegal to build structures that are more fire resilient. That's all I'll have to say for now.
Thank you. I have a follow-up later for you. Connor, climate change, global warming, I mean, it's overwhelming, I think, when we start to get into the conversation of what is happening with our planet and how these fires are continuing and what we're facing in the future. And so my first question to you is, how can individuals improve their living environments now, understanding that these kinds of fires are inevitable?
Right. Well, I think a lot has been mentioned to that point. I think one of the most important things is what Ray was just bringing up. You know, we're looking at a situation right now where we've been in a period of, well, a dry spell, so to speak, and it's it's not clear that that's going to change anytime soon. The climate history suggests that we might go back into a wet period at some point in the future. Climate change predictions, well, it's hard to say how accurate those are. But either way, it's probably best that we plan for the worst case scenario. So if we're in a state of sort of perpetual dryness, low rainfall, or unreliable rainfall, we can anticipate that the landscape is going to reflect that. And we can see already the plant communities around us starting to dehydrate and become more and more brittle and susceptible to fire. And the more we get fire in this region, the more we get fire-loving plant species. So it's kind of a positive feedback loop in a not so positive way for at least the people who dwell here. So I think it is important to look at how we can defend ourselves from the home space and outward, right? So, and that even starts with the individual, you know, the self-aware individual that understands what it means to be prepared for a crisis like that, because it may become more frequent, who knows? And if not fire, it's flood and earthquake. So being ready for those things is an important thing, and I think many of us had to confront that in one way or another this last year. You know, so, and then designing our homes or retrofitting our homes in a way that makes them at least somewhat more resistant to fire. I'm not saying we can entirely build a fireproof house, although that is possible. Usually that has to be done from scratch. But in fact, today I was at a consultation at a property in Santa Paula where the fire was completely encircling this house last year, and the client bought the house, I think after the fire, and her first investment was to completely cover the exterior with non-flammable material, remove the asphalt shingles, right, and replace it with metal, and then put in high-temperature glass windows with aluminum clad around the window frames, and then put in these vents on the attic that are called Vulcan vents that actually shut when they're exposed to high temperature. And so there are products on the market today that you can retrofit with that are going to give you a better chance. And you can also build a house that's completely resilient to fire if it's designed that way, like the John Davis's house. But we've also seen where, in some cases, like I'm looking at this flag, and I went to OVS. This flag was at OVS, and their science building, which was sort of the gold standard in terms of fire resistance, or up to the code standards for fire, collapsed. And I think that there's a lot that we need to reconsider about what we already deem to be safe. And I think these natural materials that are free and abundant offer a solution. For example, cob. It takes 1 inch per hour for heat transfer from an external flame source to get through those walls. And so if your wall is 6 inches thick with clay, sand, and straw, it's going to take a long time for that heat to be transferred into the house. And then if you have high temperature glass with steel shutters, you've got a pretty darn good chance, because fire moves pretty quickly unless you give it something to burn right around your house. So I think then as we move out from the house, we have to look at what kind of landscape we're creating. Is this a fire-prone landscape, or is this something where fire can either sort of dance through it quickly and move on, or actually be completely shunted off by vegetation with a high moisture content in the leaf tissue, right? Like the citrus and avocado orchards that sort of ensconced this valley and protected a lot of the homes, right? How do we make sort of a miniature version of that supports our homes and creates that biological buffer? And then having really good access around your structure is really important. I had a lot of experience during the fire working with the strike teams that were coming up and stationing themselves in the East End. And having good access for those trucks to get around is so crucial. And one of the other things that was observable is that a lot of the guys that were coming here to fight fire hadn't even been here before, and hadn't been here even in the light of day to see the landscape. And so grateful they're here. And they were so grateful that there were locals present to show them around so that they could be more effective at what they're doing. And that's, taking a little bit of information from South Australia, where people face this on a very regular basis and in an even more exaggerated way than we do. A lot of rural communities have a stay and defend policy because fire crews won't be able to get to them, and they have to come up with strategies themselves. There's a great book on that. It's called The Flywire House by David Holmgren. Highly suggest looking into it. It's a home retrofit book, and it's just a series of infographics to look at how you can make your house safer from the South Australian perspective, which is very well versed in this sort of design.
Thank you.
Yep.
I would like to open this up to the community if there are people who have questions.
I'm Rose Chavez Boggs. I have lived through every fire and flood and earthquake for 90 years here in Ojai. And when I was growing up, there used to be a tower on top of the mountain, and someone lived there during the fire season. And I wanted to get a thought from John McNeil what you would think about having a tower and someone living there.
And that tower you're speaking of was the U.S. Forest Service's lookout tower up on Nordoff Ridge. And it was located at that location because you could see 360-degree view of all of the forest, including down into the Ojai Valley. The difference now is we have cameras that have replaced it. So the point with that tower was to have someone and have someone visualizing the landscape for a quick notice of a brush fire or a wildland fire. We have not only cameras, we have quite a few other means to get early notification that we do have a fire to respond to. I hope that answered your question. The tower is actually still there. It's a great hike to go up there and get on the tower and see a great view.
Thank you.
Mark?
A question, we hear a lot about, especially since the fires, but we heard it before, that houses, homeowners should have a barrier, a fire break around the house to reduce the fuel to reduce the chance of the home burning for that reason. But so many homes are designed to, in effect, nestle among the flora. There's bushes and bougainvillea and all kinds of things right under the eaves and around the house. Is it the expert opinion, especially in our new normal, that we got to pull all that stuff out? Because we need to hear that, and that's the expert opinion.
I'll start. I think there's going to be some additions to this, but it's a great question. And for this whole topic, speaking for the fire department side of it, we look at prevention and we look at response. On the prevention side, we have a very robust, what used to be the weed abatement program. Officially, it's the fire hazard reduction program, and that's that 100-foot clearance that we require from all structures. It wasn't that long ago that ornamental vegetation, the bougainvilleas, the references you made, weren't considered part of that enforcement, let's say. But I can go back to the Painted Cave fire in the early 90s in Santa Barbara, and there's quite a bit of Santa Barbara wildfire histories where that you responded up there and you saw green lawns burning. So the whole land, ornamentals within that 100-foot clearance have now become a factor that are in a negative way for protecting your home. So we're trying to find that balance, and how do you still create that environment that everyone wants at their house with those ornamental vegetations, but create a fire-safe environment. And that 100-foot clearance, not only are we looking at the house having a better ability to withstand the fire, it was already spoken, I think Connor mentioned it, when we deploy, on the response side of this now, when you're on a fire engine and you're going into sometimes an area you've never seen before and you're not even in the daylight, there's a greater chance for success if the captain on that engine has cleared space to operate in. If he goes up and he sees a handful of houses and some of those houses are quite overgrown with ornamentals or whatever the story is, there's going to be a less likely they're going to position themselves because of the risk in that situation when they have other options with clearing. So absolutely. So the whole impetus behind the 100-foot clearance is for the building to stand alone. If we can't put a fire truck on every house, and we know we can't, that gives that house that much greater chance for success, but it also gives room for the first responders to operate in safely.
Will, did you want to add?
Well, I wanted to also add that a 100-foot defensible space, a lot of people think, oh, well, I just have to take out everything. And so we're not talking about moonscaping your yard. It's perfectly fine to have vegetation there. It's just that there are a few basic rules. One of the things we talk about when we do our defensible space clearance along the fuel breaks, we do what's called a mosaic pattern. So we keep, we trim things back, cut away, of course, the dead stuff, but we leave enough there. Of course, we want to leave the roots in place so that fire can't easily travel. So you don't want to have like a row of hedges because the fire can just move along those hedges. So you have a bush here and then a bush over there. As long as they're far enough away so that one won't catch the other on fire, you've got a much better chance of not creating a conflagration, creating an issue that these guys are going to look at and say there's no way we're going to go in there. So, that's one of the things we want to make sure everybody understands is when we're talking about fire safety, we're not talking about making your home look like it's in the middle of the Sahara Desert. There are a lot of ways to do that quite gracefully. And we also have wildfire safety education on our website for landscape professionals that talk about how to do that. Also the selection of the plants. There's a lot of different plants that are much more susceptible to wildfire than others. Plants that hold their moisture really well, you want to use those as opposed to things that get dry and dead at certain times of the year. So there's a lot of ways to have still a very attractive landscape and space around your home without scorched earthing it.
And I would just say, too, this was a lessons learned for us at Thatcher. We had sort of focused on the exterior of the campus and some of our larger buildings, but as we sort of watched your compatriots do their work, you know, we began to realize that we were making some of the things that we did from a landscape perspective were making it harder for them to really do their work, especially when they were checking some of our buildings, especially in the last day of the fire, or last day for us anyway, when the fire came down Horn Canyon, and we have the dormitories and stuff that were there really closely, and we have that hedge you're talking about. And, you know, it just made it harder for them to maneuver and be able to do what they needed to do, we felt. And so that's a sort of a lesson learned for us, and something we're going to improve on as we go forward, is that.
And so, and I'm going to give a different spin on this. So some ornamental growth is take away fire and everything else. Now I'm going to talk to you from a crime prevention standpoint, right? Crime prevention through environmental design. You put rose bushes outside of windows so suspects don't want to go climb through it because it's going to tear them up. Bougainvillea is the same thing. Not having bushes that are lined up together are also things to remember. So having a clear view of your home from the road makes it easier for us to see people who may not belong. And also by having your plants planted appropriately, that where we can see, but it's also going to keep suspects away, right? It's called crime prevention through environmental design. So just, you know, add that to the list of things that you're trying to weigh on balance of, okay, is my house going to burn down or is it going to get broken into? And what can we do to help ourselves in that regard? And I think there's a balance there from what is being said, that you can have plants, and just when you think about what you're going to plant, which ones are more robust against fire, which ones are going to have more of a crime prevention component to them, whether it's thorns or bees or some to that effect, be great.
I want to kind of continue that conversation for a minute. Thank you. When we look at the plants that we're planting, right? So we have our native plants, and then we have what I've been doing some Googling, invasive plants, right? Plants that shouldn't be there. And it was referenced plants that hold water more. Are those native plants? Or maybe Connor, you can, what are we planting that will respect our water source and also make us fire safe?
We should also sort of include the natural chaparral that's being decimated. People are just ripping out the baby with the bathwater.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing that's going on with preparing landscapes for fire and drought also. It's interesting the way that we're now starting to plant natives or even species from even drier climates. It's like we're forwarding the desertification of the valley through landscaping. But, you know, the interesting thing about chaparral is that many of the plants are pyrophytes. They like fire and they need it as part of their life cycle. And so where I like their function as being habitat for other native species and propagating them is a good thing, having them around your house might not be the optimal planting. I think managing healthy chaparral in the wildlands that surround us, especially in the interface between the urban and the wildland, is crucial. And one of the things that the people that lived here before Ojai was Ojai, well, I guess it was called Ojai, but in a different pronunciation. There was prescribed fire. There was fire being used to combat fire, right? So there was a very intelligent management strategy to burn off the dead wood in the vegetation that surrounded the indigenous communities that were here before. Not only did that make their inhabitants here safer, it also reduced the disease load on the plant communities and diversified them and allowed grasses to proliferate underneath trees and stopped the competitive tangle of like about 5 species that we now see dominating most of the fringe of the urban and wildland. And the ones that are dominant now are intensely flammable. And if they're not native species, they're then annual grasses, which carry fire very quickly. So anyhow, there's no easy solution for solving that part, but chaparral likes fire and needs it really to thrive. The only other disturbance tool we have to sort of revivify its health is livestock managed in a way that's not overgrazing, but just impacting the vegetation so that it knocks the dead stuff down, prunes the tips, and they grow back with health. And I think implementing some sort of grazing strategy on the vegetation that surrounds this community would be a really good idea. How to mobilize that, I'm not sure yet, but then when it comes to the domain around the house, I've already stated that many native plants are quite, well, at least the commonly planted ones, like your salvias and artemisias, they tend to be very flammable. Yeah, ceanothus, manzanita, all of them are fire resilient, but like to burn. The plants that tend to be the least flammable are cultivated plants. These are domesticated food-bearing species, right? So, and if they're not deciduous trees, like most of our fruit and nut-bearing trees are deciduous, so by the time we get into September, November, December, which is kind of the peak of our fire season, if we have severe winds like we did, all the leaves get blown off a deciduous tree at that point in the year, right? So then they're just standing there with no foliage to burn, and chances are they've been irrigated, so they're full of water. They're just a sort of column of water standing there in the yard. There's probably some flammability to the bark, but it's insignificant, I think, compared to a fully leafed out evergreen plant that has volatile oils on its leaf surfaces that is selected simply because it's native. So I think surrounding our landscapes, or our houses, the surrounding landscapes should be cultivated edible species that not only provide us with a yield, but have deciduous characteristics, or if they're evergreen like citrus or avocados, don't burn that well. Even olive trees, which combust if they're not irrigated. I was watching this happen. One of the only reasons that my farm survived the fire is because our neighbor has a strip of olive trees that are very well irrigated, so especially in that circumstance. So the leaf tissue is, while somewhat volatile, still has a lot of moisture in it, and they keep the ground very clear. So there wasn't anything for the fire to creep into the orchard and sort of use as a fuel source. And it wasn't climbing the trees. It just literally stopped dead at the orchard. And, you know, olives are more flammable compared to citrus and avocados. But yeah, I think using plant species that offer us something and also have that high leaf tissue moisture, or they're deciduous, is probably the optimal thing.
Thank you. There's a bunch of questions. Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, you go first.
I was concerned as the year went on, starting with our fire, and more firefighters lost their lives tragically. Was there talk amongst the firefighters, heads of the river, to be more safe as our dry, hot summer went on and more were endangered? Because I never heard it talked about.
Yeah, the discussions weren't going public. I think what was probably mentioned to the public was the concern for the fatigue that's going to set in. It's not just physical fatigue, it's the mental fatigue. I mean, if this doesn't motivate us all, I mean, the top 20 most destructive fires in California have 9 of them have occurred since 2015. So we are on a pace, speaking from the firefighters, that we're not sure we can hold from a response standpoint. So it is a huge concern. I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but it is such a concern that there's quite a bit of discussion at the heads of a lot of the agencies statewide. I don't know what the answers are. You know, as long as the responses are there, the firefighters are going to be responding and are going to be putting in that same effort. So I guess we're asking you for your help. The more prevention we do, the less fires we have, the less destruction we have, the less effort we'll have to put out. We can pace it along for that year. It would be the best outcome.
Thank you. The gentleman with the plaid shirt.
Yes, I'm just wondering whether, since Paradise took place, have we rethought our own evacuation plan, being able to really evacuate Ojai Valley in an organized, quick way?
I'll start. I'm sure Jim's going to have some input on this. I'm going to take the mic first in front of him. We have, and every fire, particularly these destructive fires that are quite newsworthy, are studied at great length by fire agencies and law enforcement agencies. And one of the biggest topics is the evacuations. Were they successful? Were they timed properly? And here's our biggest challenge since 2015, mentioning the most destructive fires, or the uptick, is, prior to that, it just seemed like you had more time to calculate where to evacuate, how to evacuate, and where to send them. I mean, there's quite a bit that goes into it. When you have a Paradise situation, I mean, they're evacuating that whole community. Now the concern is, when you don't have that time, is you put people in vehicles, and it's always been at night on these fires, in windy, horrible conditions to try and operate vehicles, and we're sending them where? So that's the biggest challenge. So to answer your question, yes, we study it thorough. We get all kinds of input from scientists and everyone moving forward. And I haven't studied it quite all the way yet, but the Paradise, I'll be surprised if most of those fatalities weren't in vehicles on the escape route. And as we know, the Thomas Fire had 2 fatalities. One of them was Virginia Pasola coming out of Wheeler Canyon the night of the fire, and it was a traffic accident trying to evacuate. So.
And so to dovetail on that, yes. So I sit on the disaster council with the mayor, Johnny Johnson, and the city manager, and the assistant to the city manager, James Vega, along with John McNeil, and we talk about what strategies we're using, what do we need to start forecasting to do differently. Clearly, the mass notification systems that we use, which once again is VC Alert, we really rely on you to be able to sign up for those so you get the earliest notification possible. If we've given you a voluntary evacuation notice, that's a clue, especially in this valley, that it might be time to be leaving, right? We don't want to displace you because we don't want people to get evacuation fatigue also, right? You get people that have lived through every fire for a long time, and they figure, oh, my house has survived, for the last 80 years, it's going to survive again. Well, as the chief is saying, the fires that we are seeing now are different than the fires that we used to see, and certainly the rate of spread is much greater. So when we do that initial notification, our expectation is that you will take heed and leave. When we do a mandatory evacuation, we're going to do our best to follow it up with a door-to-door interface, right? So we're going to come and knock on your door if we have time. If we have a Paradise-type fire, we may not have time to come to your door and let you know. Once again, I've said we have 5 officers up here in the whole valley. That's about 35,000 residents up here. There's only 7,500 in the city, but I only have 2 assigned to the city. It's a huge area with a very small number of officers to try and get this done. So we rely on your willingness and cooperation, and we're not going to get into any great debate when we show up at the house, right? Like I said, you're under mandatory evacuation, you need to leave. I'm not leaving. How many people are in your house? 4. Bye. And we're going to go to the next house, right? I'm not trying to be rude. I'm trying to get to the next house to save people who want to be saved. If you don't want to leave, that's on you. So there's a big message here about being prepared, right? And I think we've all hit on this preparedness part. We know we're going to have another fire. What we don't know is, are the winds going to shift it south through town, or is it going to continue to blow west like it did and spare the town? Those things we don't know because we're not in control of the wind. But you all can help by preparing your houses accordingly, having a plan, knowing where you're going to go, and start forecasting. Do I keep gas in my car? Do I have a plan of where I'm going to go if the fire breaks out here? From an evacuation standpoint, during the Thomas Fire, we used the fairgrounds, which was a poor choice for us to use because it was also where we were relocating every fire engine that was coming in and law enforcement. And so we were all trying to get into the same plot of land, which was horrible. So we won't be doing that again moving forward. And so those are some of the discussions that we have with the Office of Emergency Services, letting people know, hey, what are our evacuation shelters? What are we going to have? And Nordoff is one here that we have here that we were able to use. It's got a great defensible space around it. We also have the hospital across the street, which we're going to do everything we can to defend that, because would be a monumental task to have to evacuate the people within the care facilities there at the hospital and the hospital itself. And they're not right up against the interface. So there's some advantages for us there. But once again, the Disaster Council is working on this strategy of what we can do different than what we've got now. And I know they have the Ready, Set, Go from the fire department and from the sheriff's office. It's also Ready Ventura County, right? That website, Ready Ventura County, is not just for fire. It's for all the other, it's a multi-hazard website. get a kit, make a plan, and stay informed.
What time is it? Does somebody have the time? 5:30? Okay. I want to ask a quick question, and then I'll come back to you guys. So we're having all of these conversations, and I wanted to kind of bring it back to us as a community. I was invited, Johnny Johnston had a meeting at City Hall a couple of weeks ago with a number of people in the community, and we were talking about this same conversation, and one of the things that we were talking about was our community, right, and how we help each other. And I think that what's important, and maybe this is more a statement than a question, but because I want to talk, is that we become an intentional community. And, you know, we use the word intentional community with these new communities that are coming up where people are coming to live together and they make food together. But do you know your neighbor? Do you have their phone number? Do you know if their house is fire safe? So, you know, you're doing all of the things that you're supposed to do to make your house really safe, but if your neighbor's not doing it and their house catches on fire, chances are your house is probably going to catch on fire also. So are you talking to each other and saying, I'm planting this, do you want to plant this between our yards? I think we need to start collaborating as a community and having that conversation, and I was just maybe wondering, whether it's from the audience or from the panel, ways that you see us becoming more cohesive in this conversation about fire preparedness.
Yeah, my neighbor stayed, was up on the roof squirting a hose. We evacuated, and let me just put this into context of a recent radio interview with an experienced LA Times reporter talking about what she saw in Paradise. She thought that all the other things, like do you wet down your roof, do you clear away the grass, were secondary, very lowly secondary to the question of if there's a wind carrying lots of embers towards your house, they're going to burn that house probably from the top down. And she really gave very little credence to the sorts of things we talked about as retrofitting and this and that. So what popped into my head, and I don't know if this has ever been done, is that we had just had our house tented for termites. Well, they put a tent down over our house that covered everything in about an hour. So the question to you all is whether you know anybody who has found a material that's affordable and that would not ignite timbers, that could simply be put down over the house like tenting for termites. Huh.
So I don't have the answer to that. But if you could put one over your house to keep burglars out, that'd be great. And your cars and the other things. So, but to talk on what Liz had asked about. So after the fires, both the upper Ojai area as well as the East End area created a neighborhood watch of sorts, but that are very fire specific, very fire and flood centric, where they have basically team captains that are in charge of a certain number of homes, and they can know a couple of things. Number one, what are they doing to their homes to help retrofit or protect their structures? But more importantly, what are the vulnerabilities that they have that we may need to know when we arrive, right? So the people that are arriving to put out the fire or to assist from evacuations may not be from the Ojai Valley, and there's a good chance that we're not going to know you personally. And as a result, when we show up at your house and you say, hey, my neighbor next door is non-ambulatory, they are bedridden, can you go check on them? Well, then when I knock on the door, they don't answer, I'm going to kick the door open and go get them out of the house and make sure that we have arrangements for them to get out. So that's great information to know for us. So if you do know your neighbors, that's very valuable information that can be provided to both the fire department as well as your law enforcement officers, that we can help effect a much more successful evacuation. Anybody tent answer?
I haven't heard of or read anything about the whole house being covered, but covering openings with similar procedures that you're mentioning. Yeah, I think it's already been mentioned once, the shuttering of the windows with some kind of mechanical metal.
Only steel? Is there any other alternative material to cover windows?
There's quite a bit of material out there that's fire resistive or fireproof. Absolutely, yeah. That's not metal.
Thank you. Yeah, I was about to address that. That's something that I used on my home, and we used to protect the historic Pratt House in Ojai. There are companies that produce foam that you can spray on the house, and in particular, you want to spray it over windows and other things, and it creates it's a little bit like shaving cream, but thicker in its consistency. It's more like a toothpaste consistency. And it doesn't foam up. It's not very, very thick in terms of how wide it gets, but it's extraordinarily resistive to heat. And the trick is that it lasts for about 48 hours. So what you want to do is put it on your house and then leave. But one of the things that we've talked about at the Fire Safe Council and with County Fire is that if you're not in a position to do that, because applying it to your house takes time, and especially if there's an emergency, a fast-moving fire, and you're evacuating, another thing you can do is leave that kit in your driveway. The firefighters know what that is, and they'll sometimes have time to apply it. Now, it's I guess what I want to say is it's available, and it's something to look into because it's an excellent insulator and can really protect. So.
I noticed that a long time ago. I looked into that, and there's an automatic system for your house that's triggered by the fire and the infrared that comes specifically from a fire footprint that it essentially envelops your house. So that's one way to go, and also you can use a fireproof paint which actually blisters and creates the insulation that you want. And that's also available, and you do that ahead of time.
Right. Now, those are fairly expensive options to install, obviously, as a retrofit. And people were asking what's the name of the product that I was talking about. It's called Barricade. There are others, but that's the one that we happen to use. And so it's relatively inexpensive. A normal size home, it costs somewhere around $500 to have it. It lasts for about 5 years if you store it in your garage. So it's something to consider. It's not a solution for every situation because there are plants that you can spray it on anything. You have to really make sure with an ember-driven wildfire that you've sealed everything around the house, because no matter how protected the house is, that tent idea is a great one if somebody made that, but putting something like that on, it takes a crew of guys, and how many of those can you have and all that. But still, it's an idea, and so whatever you can do to add to the level of safety for your particular home is going to add to the level of safety for your neighbors and the city at large.
Yeah, we looked at we actually brought thermal gel, which is a competitor Barricade to the campus. Unfortunately, they got there too late, but that's actually a gel, and so that's why it stays effective for 48 hours. We're actually going to be doing a foam system where you have to be a little bit more specific about the timing because of the ember issue, but we'll have an automatic system that sprays a foam up and onto the buildings, and from a wildfire perspective, like up around the hillsides back behind us. And I think that only lasts about an hour, but it helps with the effectiveness of it. So there are options out there.
Do you have a cost on that yet?
I went to the demonstration and saw the system operate November 16th, so we're still working up what the cost is going to be. But actually, the thermal gel or the Barricade really is probably for $500 you could do a house.
So the Ventura County Fire Department, we have that product on our fire trucks, and we do use it. We use it, again, picture going up a cul-de-sac trying to defend 12 houses. If we can put gel or foam on some of those and then spend effort on some others, we can be that much more efficient. So I think where this discussion is, it's great. There is a ton of ideas out there and really good products, good enough that where your fire department is actually buying those products and putting them on their fire trucks. But I want to speak back to the group that met November 20th and the whole community effort it's moving forward now. And this is a big part of it is what products do we look into? What do we suggest for our community? Can we get into some kind of, buy a big batch buy or purchase for the community? We have so much leverage if we go after this as a community. I really think that's the only successful way to get there is the community approach, the whole team effort, including your fire department. I wasn't actually at the meeting, but I've had follow-up conversations with a lot of the leads at that meeting, and it's a real exciting. Again, if I have to motivate again by saying 9 out of the last 20 greatest destructive fires have happened in 3 years, I don't know what else gets us more talking on this. So,
well, I think what we're seeing right now in California is a symptom of dehydration on a broad scale. Clearly, that has a lot to do with rainfall, especially in the southern part of the state. So when we're going through these periods of low rainfall, I think doing everything we can to store water in the landscape, to hydrate the soils so that the vegetation is alive versus dead, or dying. And that comes with another responsibility, though, because when you sink water into the landscape and you hydrate the root systems of plants, you generate more fuel material. So, it's kind of like a catch-22 in some senses, but I thought of this actually when you were talking about the water table. I think creating more water availability in the community through stormwater catchment and the way that we manage the watershed is a crucial component of this, because if we can create water redundancy, so to speak, if we have water surplus by design, then we have the means to combat fire, without placing water at that premium or where everyone's sort of trying to scramble for that resource. But to do that, we also have to treat the watershed appropriately, where we're not sending water to the ocean as fast as possible. We're banking it in the soils and storing it in the root systems, the soil, the water table, and the living vegetation. So if we do that, then we'll generate that historic surplus of water that we did have. There's some interesting history around water in this valley, and I don't know if I need to get into all of that, but farmers used to say we have more water than we know what to do with. And so I think by design we could create a similar scenario again in the future, where we have the means to fight fire and have a less dehydrated landscape. And that all has to do with watershed improvement strategies.
That 100-foot clearance is going to work 95% of the time. I'm just taking a wild guess there, and it seems like that number's getting less and less with these fires. But when the embers are traveling up to a mile in advance of the fire because of the winds and all the conditions that we have, it's now, the house becomes a receptive fuel bed, we're calling it. So how do we harden that, right? Well, we close all the openings, we limit how fire can get to the inside of the house, because a lot of times the houses are built pretty well to withstand on the exterior, but it's something that gets inside and burns the house from the inside out, and that's always been a big concern, and the attic vent is one of the key avenues for that. So mulch, think about mulch. It's almost like powder. When the wind is blowing, it's like a dust that's ignited, and it's getting into the smallest of openings. And I hate to say it, and I know it's been studied. I don't know the exact outcome, but I was up at Ojai Valley School at their science building probably an hour after it burned down, and we were all kind of surprised. Well, how could that burn? The way it was built, when you look at it from the outside with concrete, steel, tight closures, it was surrounded by mulch. So my guess, and I'm not, the official report will come out at some point on that, but my guess is that mulch had some kind of impact on that.
Mulch should be used in irrigated landscapes. It should not be a broad covering over the landscape that's never going to get water from irrigation, right? Because at the end of the dry season, if you've mulched way outside the bounds of where your irrigation reaches, that's a very high density fire fuel too, because it's like, oak wood chips or something like that. That's like little briquettes sitting out all over your yard. So I was having this discussion today with a client, because her landscape was mostly annual grass around the house. And we're like, well, what do we do? Rip out the annual grass? Because when you weed whack it, it's still there. It's still a fuel and it moves fast. And then she was saying, well, maybe we should put wood chips down. And I was like, well, only if you're prepared to keep that at 80% humidity all the time is that going to work. Because when it becomes airborne, that's when it's dry, first of all. That's a problem, as you suggested. So, yeah, mulch only in irrigated landscapes, I think is, yeah.
I'm not an advocate of gravel or cement. Yes, it doesn't burn, but you also want to think about during summer months how hot that gets. So we put down gravel around trees and we're actually creating an oven that now the tree roots are trying to survive under. Also, embers kind of skip along those kinds of surfaces. So, I would advocate for succulent ground covers that don't allow the embers to skip across and get it caught in. And I just had this conversation actually right before I came over here with someone who suggested that to me, that they had just had a conversation about that. And I want to give props to Sousa, one of our council members, because she brought up the gravel aspect to me a few months ago and talked about some of the new designs that are new surfaces being put down and noticing that people are putting gravel down and how that's actually a detriment to us. So if instead of gravel, if you can do mulch and keep it wet, that would be better, or a succulent landscape.
It's kind of a tough one to answer. I mean, it's as comprehensive as all the ideas on how we harden a home. How do you now go look in a home that just withstood a fire? And if you're a week after the fire passed, it's a pretty good chance that it's going to continue to stand. I mean, but the attic, well, I guess the easiest way to answer that is think about where embers could get in, because it's going to be a fire that starts on the inside, most likely in this situation, 7 days after the fire's passed. So look at where the openings are on the exterior to the interior, and typically that's attic vents, it's doors that were left open, windows that were left open, any cracks, any compromises in the exterior structure. So that's where I would start.
So Edison, who is our power provider here locally, has a new program where they do that exact thing. They start forecasting out now for whether or not they're going to do the public safety shutoff, where they will proactively turn off our power, which they'll be shutting it off at their main source. They're not going to be able to do it at the granular level by street. It will be, a neighborhood will be completely darkened as a result of it. So from a notification standpoint, right, when I go to try and evacuate you by a cell phone, if you don't have one that's charged and now your power's out too, it's eliminating my ability to use technology to an advantage. But at the same point, if that's what started the fire, if they shut it off before it happens, then we don't have 3 weeks of fire in our valley. We have a couple days without power till the wind stops. So it's a balance for Edison, and PG&E I know is looking at it as well. But they do have a program that they just started. Their goal is to give you, I think it's 24 hours notice that they're going to shut your power off. They're going to try and give us 25 hours of notice that they're going to do it, right? So that we know what to expect. But the very first time that they were looking at implementing it, it was much less time than that, because we were experiencing a rain event, which is incredibly rare here, right? We were experiencing a rain event, and the 24-hour notification they were going to give was based on a wind event that was following that. So they were like, okay, if we tell them that we're going to shut the power off because we're going to have experiencing fire, they're like, wait, it's raining. This is not the time we need it turned off. But it's a balance, right? And so, but once again, those are the discussions that we're having with our Edison partners about what they can do currently, because obviously they do have systems that are above ground. I know a lot of communities are working on undergrounding their material to try and prevent that from happening. So to answer, the short answer is yes, they do have a program in place, and you should be able to read about it on their website as well, about what that public safety shutoff looks like. Take a look at your policies, talk to your insurance provider, make sure you have the insurance necessary for your home now, not what it was when you bought it 20, 30 years ago. Make sure you're covered for fire, make sure you're covered for flood, For the hazards that we're talking about, earthquake insurance is remarkably less expensive than it used to be, although the deductible is still high. It is available for a lot less than before. So those are some of the pre-planning things you can do before the disaster, so that when you get back home, if you do lose everything, you can rebuild without suffering that additional loss of being told you didn't have enough coverage and now you can't even rebuild your home.
Well, regarding rebuilding, I just encourage everyone to, if you're going to rebuild or build a new structure of some sort, to really educate yourselves, because the education isn't going to necessarily come from your general contractors, your builders, your building and safety, or your city planning department. And that's just an encouragement to look at what other materials might be available that are less flammable than are generally used.
Once again, I think one thing that we can all speak to is preparation, right? Preparedness. And so I would like to thank Liz for putting this together with whoever else helped you organize this, being able to get out and speak to the community about what our concerns are, let you know what we're thinking and what we're doing is really important. So the more we can get out and share that information with you, both John and I, you can be our advocates to help us do our job much more effectively with the limited resources we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.